I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
And the reason why I am into this story is that I'm using it in my new book, which is coming out later this summer, early fall, called The Gap in God's Country, A Longer View on Our Culture Wars. The reason I use it in my book is because it is so good at describing the interior turmoil, the worries, the anxiety, the thoughts that pop into a person's mind when they're experiencing profound, disorienting dislocation. As I argue in my book, and I think we all know, a big problem for us today, whether we've articulated or not, is deep, profound anxiety, and sometimes depression flowing from that, having to do with not being able to keep up with all of the demands for change and changing work. It is difficult to grasp. And sometimes fiction does a better job at explaining things like this than some dry work of scholarly literature or even a classic of philosophy. Sometimes fiction helps us to be able to get into the headspace, to really contemplate that, and through it to contemplate ourselves. So that is why I dwelled in my book and now am on this channel on this story. The author's great, B.S. Naipaul, author of many stories and books, so I recommend him generally. So let's get back into the story. Yeah, at some point, Santosh sees some fellow Indians in a park in Washington, D.C., doing traditional dances, selling traditional foods. And for a moment, he feels like he is at home, or he is somewhat elated by finally seeing people that seem like himself. But then after a very brief period of time, as he's watching them, he realizes that he is not at home with them because they are doing a job and is what they absolutely have to do in order to make money. Then they are going far away to wherever it is they're living. He knows not where. And then they will come back again the next day. So they are performers in a different sense than they would have ever been performers in his home country. They're in a different context. He can't identify with them. He's got a very different position. And so, and oftentimes he has these moments of great, oh my gosh, I finally figured it out, or, oh, I finally feel like I'm at home. And then almost immediately, he's smart enough to realize, no, I'm not at home. This is not the same sort of thing. I know nothing about these people. They're strangers to me. So he's experiencing the loss of cultural identity here, and he's seeing the people in the park as people who are playing a part, not living in it. Okay. Big difference. Playing a part for others, sort of play acting, as opposed to even if one is performing, one can be embedded in the culture in an authentic way, or one can be, I hate to, like the word inauthentic is not what he would even probably use. I'm trying to get across a distinction, being authentic versus being kind of consciously performative for the sake of making money. Okay. And again, I'm not saying people don't do this in their own countries for making money, but he's trying to make this distinction. It feels fake to him. It feels very disconnected from his culture, from his background. And so he feels even more disoriented than he did before. And he says that after buying the suit, and then deciding he just can't wear it and having these types of experiences, he no longer sees his boss the same way. I think that's the last quote I read last time. Suddenly he sees things with more objectivity. He sees his boss as just a little scared man like himself, which is more objective, which in our society in the United States, we sometimes seem to think that objectivity is good. You know, we criticize people for not being objective. But objectivity is also very cold, and he feels that coldness of now that he sees his boss objectively, he can no longer identify with him. He's no longer feeling a part of him, a detachment of him as his superior, but rather, yes, more as equals, but very separate. So he feels this separateness and this need to then keep secrets from this man. Okay. He's not going to tell him that he wasted money buying a suit he's not going to wear, or that he spent too much on this or that, or that he has a relationship with a woman, a Black woman that he has, despite the fact that he has prejudices, has still formed a sort of seems like casual liaison with her at this point. So he's not going to say any of that. And he also feels very trapped now by his boss, that even more than ever, he is simply, an employee, and one whose options are not great. So he feels this disconnection. And in his relationship with the woman, he experiences it as kind of utilitarian. Okay, there's a word we use for that. I'm not going to use it, but that seems to be what it is going on here. Um, he has sex with her, but doesn't particularly enjoy it. Still does it. He says he sort of lets it take over at a certain point, but then he like immediately regrets that, and it makes him feel more alienated and disconnected than ever. Okay. He even says he goes and he takes a shower and he just wants to forget about it, but he's going to go back. He's going to go back. And eventually that relationship turns into something pretty significant in this story. But he never really feels differently. In fact, I can tell you he does not feel differently at all. Very disconnected from the relationship, still somewhat put off because he has these racial prejudices, but yet he lets it happen to himself, and he probably doesn't even really know why. And then after that experience, we have an interlude here in the story where there's 4 days in which Washington is burned to the ground and to rubble in places. And he's looking at this as an outsider. And he's looking at the fact that most of the people doing the rioting are Black people, and they're extremely angry. And over the course of this description, and this is the 1968 riots that broke out after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, assassinated. Most of this description reveals that he's not really fully aware of the context, partly because he's an outsider, partly because he himself has racial prejudices, and when he came to the United States, barely thought of Black people as worthy of being there. Was irritated by having to be around so many. Now he sees them just laying waste to parts of Washington, D.C. as they, in their anger, protest what has happened and just their general situation. And something happens inside of him over time after he observes enough. And he comes out the other end. He stays at home during these 4 days, watches things on television, sort of hunkers down with his boss in their apartment. But then at a certain point, he goes out and he starts just walking around because he's like, well, why not? In a way, he is having a sort of an apocalyptic mood. Uh, he goes out and he starts to see that some of the people who no doubt had engaged in the rioting look at him with a sort of pride and respect and smile as though they have something in common. Because indeed they do. He just hasn't realized it up till now. So he has this experience of seeing these people in a different light and noticing that they see him as somebody whom they share and a certain inequality, a certain experience. Um, Interesting. And so there is this sense of equality that he at least briefly absorbs or experiences equality and extremity. Okay. And so this is an interesting development in his mental space. He says, I had taken after the fire to going for long walks in the city. And one day, when I wasn't even thinking of escape, when I was just enjoying the sights and my new freedom of movement, I found myself in one of those leafy streets where the private houses had been turned into business premises. And I saw a fellow countryman superintending the raising of a signboard on his gallery. The signboard, he told me, that the building was a restaurant, and I assumed that the man in charge was the owner. He looked worried and slightly ashamed, and he smiled at me. This was unusual because the Indians I had seen on the streets of Washington pretended they hadn't seen me. They made me feel they didn't like the competition of my presence or didn't want me to start asking them difficult questions. I complimented the worried man on his signboard and wished him good luck in his business. He was a small man of about 50, and he was wearing a double-breasted suit with old-fashioned wide lapels. He had dark hollows below his eyes, and he looked as though he had recently lost a little weight. I could see that in our country he had been a man of some standing, not quite the sort of person who would go into the restaurant business. I felt at one with him. He invited me in to look around, asked my name, and gave his. It was Priya. Okay, so he's met this new man, a restaurateur, and somebody who strikes up a conversation with him. And then they have fellow feeling. Santosh, for probably the first time, really feels like maybe he feels at home. Again, though, he has these experiences repeatedly in this story. He feels at home, he feels more relaxed, and Priya offers him a job. He says, I can't pay you very much. However, you could live with me. I have a room. And it turns out, well, at first Santosh thinks it's, the closet in the room is where he's, proposing he live. And then he realized it's the whole room. It's got like plenty of space and storage and a bedroom and cupboards and so on and so forth. And he is just taken by it. He'll have some pocket money, he says. He'll have food and a place to live. Well, the thought of leaving his employer at this point is really enticing because now he feels downtrodden. He doesn't feel like a part of his employer with a sort of dignity because of feeling that. No, he feels like now he's just a low employee who shares in his boss's humiliation in this foreign country. Whereas here, he can recognize the role this man wants to play and that he wants him to play. And he would be among people that were more of his station. Now, he takes the job and he doesn't even notify his employer. he just stops coming around. And we don't know what happens in the meantime if his employer is looking for him or not. And Priya, the restaurateur, pays him instead of a few bucks a week, $40 a week. So he's getting paid quite a lot more. And he's thinking that's amazing. But later on, he is going to find out even that is like way lower than what Priya could afford to pay him. But at this point, it feels pretty good. And he feels momentarily free. He's a free man. You know, he has these moments of, I am a free man now. Finally, I'm free. But then not very long goes by before he is, you know, overhearing some of the wait staff and workers for the restaurant who happen to be Mexican. And they start talking about their green card status. And he overhears them talking enough that he realizes that some of them are not legal or have had their, you know, their credentials expire or never had them. And they are worried. They express fear about being found out. And suddenly, Santosh realizes he is illegal now too, because he came to the United States attached to this diplomat. So he had special dispensation from the requirements to get a green card. So he has no green card and he has no prospect of getting a green card. And he's basically an illegal immigrant. And so now he feels trapped again. He feels like he has if he stays right there, he's probably going to be okay as long as they don't raid the restaurant, but there's always that chance. And he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't really want to go back to his boss. So he does indeed stay. I think this is very poignant here. He says, reflecting on this situation, I was good looking. I had lost my looks. I was a free man. I had lost my freedom. So this seesaw experience is one that I really want people to allow to sink in. Because I think we are having that experience more and more, that, you know, whether it's, you know, being enticed by a particular product or experience or by a job prospect that fizzles or promotion that never comes about, or a relationship that sounds like it's going to be forever, but then almost immediately disintegrates, a friendship that is blown up after 20 years over, you know, something that might seem trivial or might have seemed trivial not that long ago. You know, losing a job that we've had for 30 years because of downsizing, whatever it is, you know, like we're having these experiences of, I've got it, I've made it, I don't have to worry anymore, followed almost immediately by everything is falling apart. I think this is an experience, unfortunately, that all too many of us can identify with to a certain extent. And what's interesting to me about this is that what he's describing in a way is his assimilation into American culture, because that constant roller coaster ride or seesaw experience is emblematic of the American cultural experience. And it's replicated even in our movies and television shows and our cultural products, where it is often romanticized. Anyway, I hope you can see now why this story was important to me and why I included it in the book. And I think I'll be able to finish this up in another week. I, again, encourage people to get the book or get the audio book. This is In a Free State by V.S. Naipaul.